Welcome to Peeranormal. This is episode 18. And once again, we have with us Trey Strickland, who produces this and does a wonderful job of it. We've got Brian Godawa, and fresh from Hollywood again, Doug Van Dorn and Doug Overmeyer, and of course, Natalina is with us. So thanks to everybody for being here. And the topic for tonight is Samhain and Halloween. Now, we're tempted to look at that and say Samhain and Halloween, but that is not the way we pronounce this name, so we might as well start by trying to get the term right. To the English eye, it looks just like, Samhain, like what could be simpler? But according to a linguistic website that I found on the NC State website, the larger website, this term is pronounced either Samhain, like ow, the OW in cow, or Samhain with the OW like glow. So Samhain. We're going to try to remember to pronounce the term correctly. But Samhain or Samhain is an Irish Gaelic term for the time of summer's end, as well as a festival to mark the end of the harvest season and the onset of winter, which in the Gaelic Celtic calendar marked the beginning of the year, not the end of the year, but the beginning of the year. So this is associated with sort of a New Year's kind of celebration. And because the Celtic day began and ended at sunset and not sunrise, the festival was traditionally celebrated from October 31st to November 1st. Samhain, or again, Samhain, is the ancient backdrop to Halloween, and that's where we want our discussion to focus. Not only in terms of calendar is this true, again, the October 31st date, but also in terms of basically all the modern elements of how Halloween is celebrated today. So what we want to do is we want to get into the ancient, festival, some of its customs. It's going to lead us to some really interesting places. And for this episode, what I asked everyone to read were three short selections from Hastings' Encyclopedia of Religion and Ethics. In its day, again, this is an early 20th century resource, but in its day, this was the go-to reference source for anything that was associated with religion and ethics. It's 12 or 13 volumes. It's very long, detailed reference work, and it is available to public domain via archive.org. So we read the entry on Celtic cosmogony, Celtic feasts and festivals, and Irish deities. And then we read two journal articles, one by Helen Sewell Johnson entitled November Eve Beliefs and Customs in Irish Life and Literature. That's from the Journal of American Folklore. It's a 1968 article. And lastly, an article by Jack Santino entitled Halloween in America, Contemporary Customs and Performances. That's from the journal entitled Western Folklore, 1983. So our topic is Samhain and Halloween. And I'm just going to open it up. What did you guys think as you were reading this? I know ultimately where this is going to gravitate. Because of sort of who we are. This has some really interesting connections to the ancient biblical worldview of demons, giants, and the realm of the dead. But again, we're going to get there. But your impressions, did any of you know anything about this?
Yeah, so I think I want to start on this one. This is Doug Van Dorn. And the reason why is because I was in Ireland last week talking about this. A missionary flew me over there to talk about my Giants book. And the goal was to try and reach some of the Wiccans that are in a small town that he's trying to minister to. And so I opened up my presentation by looking at some of the mythology of Ireland. And I came across the Fomorians and the Tuatha De Danann and some of these other people. And then when I started reading this morning for the show, my jaw dropped because I don't think I've ever read about them before, 2 weeks ago. And now all of a sudden I'm getting bombarded with it.
Yep. Yeah, the Fomorians are really interesting.
Yeah, the idea that both the Fomorians and the Tuatha De Danann are either gods or more likely demonic because of their relationship to giants. And I take demonic there to be the Jewish early Christian idea rather than you talking about in the Old Testament, the guardian demons. So more the disembodied Nephilim sort of a thing as they would talk about it. So totally fascinating.
Yeah, we'll for the sake of the listeners, we'll set up how these two things relate. But that's really interesting that you were there because this is still celebrated.
Oh, absolutely.
In pagan communities.
Yeah, he brought us over there just before they start decorating for Halloween on purpose so that we wouldn't be freaked out by it. But they just before we left, some of the places were already it was completely decked out in ways that I can't even begin to think of would happen over here. There are restaurants and schools and all sorts of things.
Anybody else, had you heard of this before or any of these elements?
I'm still a little bit traumatized by this, and I'll tell you why. I always have some sort of trauma to bring to the table. But a few years ago, it might have been 2 years ago or so, I was invited by a couple of people that I won't name, prominent people, to join them on a radio show, a very popular live radio show that takes callers. And the idea that they had presented to me was this was going to be this Halloween show, and that there needed to be this voice of reason in the Christian community with regard to Halloween. We were going to talk about the history of it and where maybe people get a little bit overly excited about the occult connections and stuff like that. That was the whole idea. These were two people who were scholars, written a lot of books, and for some reason they asked me, probably because of my past knowledge of the occult, to join them on this program. So I went on the show, and as soon as the callers started coming in, attacking us, both of these big, strong, smart guys backed off and started agreeing. And I was left as the lone person talking about Halloween from what I was trying to consider like a rational, reasonable thing. And it really scarred me because I was so left in the dust. And I cannot tell you how much hate mail I got about it, of people questioning whether or not I was even a Christian. So yes, I've talked about this subject before.
Hate mail builds character. Just remember
that. I'll go with that.
Anybody else? Anyone less traumatized?
Well, this is Gadawa. I had heard just cursory understanding of origins of Halloween throughout the years, and I come from a perspective that's all these Christians who think that if they uncover the pagan origins of, holidays like Christmas and such and Easter, that they've somehow shown that they're evil. I actually don't accept that in principle, because I definitely believe in cultural appropriation and subversion. In other words, I believe that we're myth-making creatures as well as myth-following creatures. So we need to have rituals, and we need to have embodied sort of, holidays, and the like. And so I don't believe I'm all for taking previous pagan holidays and transforming them into Christian versions. I don't think that it always works, as I think these papers indicates, unfortunately. And so I'll admit
this would be a good example.
Exactly. So, but in principle, I accept, because actually the Bible does it as well. God does it. So if God does it by transforming pagan notions and images like Leviathan and such, then I think that it's appropriate. So I stand against that. But even having said that, when I starting reading these papers, this whole mythology of the Gaelic and Celtic and Irish mythology behind it is completely new to me. And I speak as one who's studied a lot of more like, Mesopotamian, Sumerian, and Canaanite. And I'm like, oh, okay, this is a whole new area that I'm going to probably, delve into soon, because it's fascinating, but it's also, overwhelming, because there's just so much behind it, in terms of the mythology. Yeah. But yeah.
Yeah, and it's its own critter too. I mean, there are some things, as we'll get into during the episode here, that are really fascinating and fairly direct overlaps, with biblical thinking. Of course, that raises the question, how old is are the elements to Samhain? How old, or did they sort of arise in a post biblical way?
Yeah.
That's an open question because of the source material. But then there are other elements that really it would be hard to find, some sort of biblical correlate as well. So you get both, but it's really kind of interesting. For the sake of the listeners, again, unless anyone else wants to say, "Hey, I had heard of this." Anybody else?
Well,
I'm in Gadawa's boat. I mean, I'd heard a little bit, but I'd never really jumped into it. Go ahead.
yeah, this is Doug Overmeyer. I I was sort of it was Satan's Holiday camp, a bunch of years ago, and now I'm also in Brian's camp where it's Christians have attempted to subvert this, and the attempt was like over 1,000 years ago. And Christians went after this holiday over a period of centuries, and then that was all really interesting to me. But the Gaelic origins of it, I was actually reminded of Tolkien, actually, especially in his sort of his stuff in the Silmarillion, more like his mythical world building, and I can see where like he maybe mined some of this, maybe not the specific material. I think he was more in the Germanic area, but just sort of that worldview and that perspective of these mythical creatures who Christians later said were all demons. I don't think the Gaelic, for the arrival of Christianity, they didn't think of them as demons. They were just their deities, and so we can get into that. But and I never really thought about. I mean, I was troubled by some of the articles. I mean, the ones about the sort of the Irish religion, and then the journal articles sort of like calm me down a little bit, because they were more like anthropological and like let's figure this thing out and what is going on in our culture today about it, and that really calmed me down a little bit as well.
Yeah, it again, for the sake of for the listener, let me just get into this a little bit further, kind of try to summarize, some of I guess the gist of it. All right, let me just lift a little bit from the Santino article. He says at one point, most of what we know of Samhain is contained in the ancient Irish sagas, but these were not written down until sometime between the 9th and the 12th centuries. I think there's another article that specifically says the earliest written record that we have is the 9th century. And he says, while the Christian missionaries had arrived by the 5th century. So for sure, these beliefs are older than the 9th century AD. But as far as the written material, that's the earliest we have, at least at present time. And Santino says that again, Samhain was about seasonal ideas of time, blending that with supernatural ideas of life and death. Coming at the time of the year it associated the fruits of the harvest with ideas of the afterlife and the other world. On Samhain, the entrances to the other world are open. And then he quotes a source, "Great was the darkness of that night, and demons would appear on that night always." Again, this is a Christian source. And Santino says another place, "It was believed that at the time of transition to the new year," remember in their calendar, winter was the beginning of the year. So it was believed at the time of the transition to the new year, the souls of those who had died during the year assembled, and the living lit bonfires and sacrificed fruits and vegetables in their honor to expiate their sins. The souls of the dead were allowed passage to the land of the just. On the eve of Samhain, souls were a-traveling, is how he puts it. Now, one of you mentioned about the subversion of this. Pope Gregory is mentioned in Santino's article in 601 AD. He more or less just declared that we are going to intentionally subvert this. We're going to intentionally appropriate it. He ordered missionaries to not try to abolish it or ban it or make it an evil thing, in and of itself, but to try to subvert it. And that's actually where we get this blending of Samhain with All Souls Day, okay, which of course, is another precursor to Halloween. So that there was a very deliberate attempt to try to Christianize this thing, to essentially divert attention away from a mythological, view, or a pagan view, and then turn the attention over to something where that could sort of mediate Christian teaching, while keeping the trappings of this. But as Brian said, you could look at this one and say, well, boy, did this really work? And there's a lot of material in the reading that we did that would suggest, oh, it didn't really work that well. Because they're parts of the, you had the bonfire, which I just mentioned, okay, and that's again supposed to represent the sun, and it's intended to aid this. I mean, think about winter. It's going to be darker sooner and all that kind of stuff, and so we have to remind people that the sun is in its descendancy, but it's going to reappear. So we have to aid the sun in its course and its fight with the dark powers, and so on and so forth. This is very typical, of what we think of again as pagan, kind of thinking, the celebrations. So from the fire that was again supposed to, remind people of this cycle, fire was taken from that big fire to kindle each fire in the house. Again, to connect all the people with this. They did, slaughter, cattle. There's some evidence of human sacrifice, in certain, cultures, certain periods. You would have people run around in animal skins. You'd have people dress as women because the sacrifice was supposed to be the sacrifice of the harvest spirit, which was conceived of as female. So again, you have the dressing up in all sorts of different ways. It's really interesting, though, that this became at one point associated with a tribute demand from the Fomorians, which is like, well, who are those people? Okay, who are they? This practice and this celebration and the calendar took the Samhain and then merged it with this notion that the ancient peoples of this particular area, Celtic, tradition, Irish, tradition, they were at one point put under tribute by some group called the Fomorians, where they had to surrender 2/3 of the children born within the year. They had to surrender a portion of the year's corn and its milk to the Fomorians, during this celebration. And again, we can get into this because the Fomorians, again, as was already mentioned, depending on where you land on the etymology of the term, would be these demonic giants, spirits of the giants and whatnot. And the original people, again, that were paying tribute were believed to be descendants from Noah and Noah's sons. So you get all this sort of mix, but basically there's nothing that you can't really think of. The witches, the demons, the dressing up, the exchanging of gifts, the pumpkins, the corn stalks, everything that we sort of associate with Halloween, both in terms of the, what most people, or not most people, what Christians would think of as demonic, and then other people would consider sort of just harvest season stuff. It all seems to be traceable to this. So, what did you think of some of the trajectories here? Let's just throw it out that way.
I think it's worth noting that witches, as we conceive of them tied to Halloween, aren't Wiccans. Like, it's not really, it's sort of an Americanized way of thinking about demonic powers that live in, like a demonic entity that lives in the forest and might come, like fairy. In the Middle Ages, it'd be fairy, or which fairy isn't a tiny little, little thing with wings. It's like a terrifying entity that lives in the forest, and don't go out there. It might snap you, and and haul you off into the underworld as a prisoner, or maybe you'll get lucky and get a beautiful fairy who is a spiritual entity and will mate with you, and then who knows what will be produced from that union. So that, I mean, these are the sort of the myths of that era, and so the bad ones were conflated in America as witches. They would be flying around and they would snatch children and that sort of thing. So I thought that was really interesting. When the Irish started settling in the States after the potato famine, or during the potato famine, they brought these ideas, this cultural memory and these cultural practices into America, who already had sort of ideas about what witches were, and the modern phenomena sort of evolved from that. It's just, I got a sense of the vast amount of history that went on. I mean, we're talking centuries before the Christians got there. There were probably thousands of years of practice, and then the Christians were trying to invade this area with the gospel for centuries, and that's just, I mean, that's centuries, and it's easy for us to look at today's practices and think, it's all Satan, but it's really not. I mean, they worked hard. The Christians, they went in waves and waves over. I mean, it's just amazing, the culture, like Brian said, trying to culturally appropriate these ideas. But what was going on in the spirit realm, and how the original people there, not the original people, but the Celts, how they were trying to understand the spiritual reality and their ideas of sort of territorial spirits, and some of them mating with humans, and then these giants who were like pushed into the hills. And I found all that just, I mean, richly great fodder for the imagination. But it's easy for me to say that in the 21st century. If you're living in the 2nd century, before the arrival of the Christians, how terrifying those hills really would have been, and these practices. And, when the onset of winter and suddenly it's dark at 4 p.m, I mean, it's no wonder they wanted rituals to help the sun come back in the spring. Mm-hmm. I mean, all the nature worship and the nature deities, it makes sense from a sort of a pagan oral tradition, primitive tradition, before pre-modern ideas.
This is Godow. I just want to add something in there too. One of the little legends that I found interesting that I didn't know before was in the Santini article, and it's where he mentions the jack-o'-lantern, and he says that the jack-o'-lantern is said to be the wandering spirit of a blacksmith named Jack, who was too evil to get into heaven, but because he had outwitted the devil, was not allowed into hell. Expelled from hell, he scoops glowing coal in the vegetable he is eating and uses it as a lantern to light his way as he wanders the earth. I'm already thinking of movies here now, like, okay, and I would be remiss if I don't mention this too, that one of the connections with the fairies was these mounds, and fairies were connected to these mounds, and there's a whole mythology of that. And there is a movie that came out a while back, and it went nowhere. It has a terrible title. It's called The New Daughter. And it stars Kevin Costner. And I just want to recommend it because it's kind of interesting. It wasn't a great horror film, but it was a horror film that dealt with this notion of this mound and fairies in there, And so it was sort of a horror movie bringing, up to date that sort of fairy, legend. And sometimes I find horror films are a good way to capture some of that mythology, and a lot of times they're not, these horror movies are not arbitrary. They're not just made up stuff. The writers actually go and they draw from these histories, Kind of fascinating.
It's also interesting as another pop culture connection. When I was reading the article where they talk about the mummers, and how they were paying tribute to the Fomorians by wearing masks and imitating the spirits of the dead and collecting food and drink, and they were referred to as mummers, and they would go mumming and they would do these parades. And in the early 2000s, there was a really popular song by Lorena McKennitt called The Mummers Dance. And that's what that song was about. And I remember just kind of being hippy dippy at that time and thinking, oh, this is this really cool kind of Celtic song. And I had no idea what it was actually about. But that's what the song is about. It's about putting on masks and tying ribbons on trees and doing all of these rituals. And if you Google it, I think it was like somehow became like a top 40 song at the time, and everyone was singing it. And no one knew that that's what this song was about. It's about these mummers that were imitating the dead in an effort to appease these Celtic gods. Very interesting.
Yeah, that was really, I'm from the East Coast. So, in like Philadelphia and some of these other places, this was an annual, and I think it was New Year's Day as well. I don't know if it was Halloween, but there was an annual mummers parade. I mean, that maybe there still is. And I used to wonder, like, what in the world is going on here? Because just the term and all the costumes and stuff like that. So, yeah, I had no idea that they're actually dipping into this pool.
Well, it makes sense if they would do it on New Year's Day, because it initially was the New Year, November 1st.
Yeah, that was really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I'll tell you what the articles did for me. It in my head, not that, I'll put it this way. I didn't need to be forced to answer this question, but I thought there are a lot of Christians, who do need to be forced, to ask this or answer this question. And that is, on the one hand, we are sort of predisposed as Christians to look at early Christian writers like Bede, the Venerable Bede, or something out of the Church Fathers or whatever, and give them the benefit of the doubt that they are honestly reporting stuff to us. And that's good. I mean, I don't have any problems with that assumption that they're doing the best they can, to tell us what's going on and why. But that also means if we give them the benefit of that doubt, that we've got to take seriously what they're saying here. Okay, that the notion that Halloween is connected to, this kind of pagan stuff and very, very ancient. That isn't just sort of a contrived idea, by wacky Christians or whatever. I mean, there's something to it. Now, they might be overreacting, obviously, but it's not just sort of something invented so that now we can go pick on a holiday, or because it's not in the Jewish calendar, so we shouldn't be doing it. It's not that, but there actually is something here, and I think people need to realize that. But then the deeper question and the broader question, as Brian already brought up, is, okay, why were these connections made? Both culturally. And then in this case, we have this sort of mediating, this bridge, this All Souls Day, for in the Christian context, it gets married to this, and then that has some relationship to Halloween. So that's actually the better question. Why was this done? And here, we have again an attempt at subverting, a set of pagan ideas, for the purpose of conversion. And we can quibble about, well, were they really preaching the gospel or not? I understand that issue, and that's a very real issue as well. But it's not like the church was trying to be evil. Like, what's the best way we can adulterate our teachings and make them more evil? Or make them gateways to evil. What they're trying to do is the opposite. And again, we can talk about how well they did the job, or even if the strategy made sense in whatever given context. But the people who are writing about this, they're not like disagreeing with the tactic. They're not saying that we're making up a new like Christian linkage to this pagan stuff so that we can talk. They're actually seizing on ideas that are already in the culture. And I bring that up because of the whole Noah thing. I mean, I find it interesting that you actually have somewhere, who knows how it got there, because the articles do try to make the point that a lot of this has to be Aboriginal. But how in the world do we get this notion that Noah's granddaughter, okay, I don't know how to pronounce the name, but Cessair, Cessair, comes to settle this part of the world with 50 women and 3 men, and they, of course they eventually die off because of a plague. And then a new group comes along, the Nemedians, and then their leader was Partholon, and he's supposed to be descended from Noah. Like, how did that has to come from somewhere? That is pre, Christian. The Christian writers are just reporting on this and then trying to, subvert it.
So as I was studying for this presentation, I came across this. There's a book called The Book of Invasions. It's from the 12th century, and obviously some sort of an Irish monk that's writing down the history, and he's talking about this Cessair legend, and as they're writing, they bring up the Kurgan people from the Caspian Sea region. And as I read that, I was really freaking out because as I was writing the giant book all those years ago, I came across an article by this woman named Marija Gimbutas called The Kurgan Culture and the Indo-Europeanization of Europe. And she kind of traces this migration of the Kurgan people from exactly that area, kind of the Black Sea, Caspian Sea. And then they go into Galatia, they go up into Gaul, and then they end up in Ireland, which is exactly what the myth tells you. And what's so strange about that to me is that, as I was thinking about the giants and kind of how they were kicked out of the land of Canaan and where did they go from there? And you can kind of trace the exact sort of a thing. So you hear these legends of giants in Galatia, you hear Julius Caesar, you can read him talk about this in his Annals of War about these giants up in France that the Roman armies couldn't beat. And then you have these myths of the giants up in Ireland. And it's like, so how did those stories get there was kind of the question that you asked. And it just seems like that's exactly what the history of people tell us is that they're not myths. They're not just made up things. There's some sort of a kernel of historical truth to them.
Yeah, there's something going on there.
Yeah, so it's like what we have here is the normal progression in a way of what we're seeing is resonances of the biblical truth that are in these ancient, Celtic legends. And, we've been talking about how, these kinds of pagan festivals were subverted or culturally appropriated by the church. But in truth, it goes back farther, and the paganism is itself appropriating the Christian truths. In other words, that's what history is the adaptation and, in a sense, a kind of an evolution of traditions and legends going all the way back to the original, which we as Christians here are arguing, it's rooted in a biblical truth. And of course, they're all spins and twistings and distortions, because every culture, our belief system is that man is inherently sinful. And so therefore even his imagination and everything he does, even though he has the truth within him and he knows the truth, he suppresses it in unrighteousness. And so he creates mythologies that you have to have some truth in a lie for it to be truly effective on who we are as human beings. And I think that's what I see going on here, is these elements that are rooted in the biblical truth as we understand it is why they've had such historical resonance and connection with people. And that is truly fascinating.
What I found interesting, whether you take let's just take a regional view of the flood here for the sake of the discussion. Oral tradition of a flood and then a small number of people who survive that and then their descendants spread out. Just the very general idea that works in this part of the world because of the Mediterranean, and its proximity. You just migrate north, and you get these places that Brian and Doug just mentioned geographically that have these stories, these episodes. So it's not. We shouldn't be too surprised if we have elements of the flood tradition, and of course, the giant traditions that go along with that in these places in this part of the world. What I thought was really interesting was the term, Fomorians. Okay, I'm going to read a little bit. Yeah, I actually found Wikipedia useful here in terms of summary. I mean, you can go out to the literature and get a lot more detail, but for the sake of the episode, I'm just going to read a little bit because it has an entry on Fomorians, which is an old Irish term. So it says, the Fomorians are a supernatural race in Irish mythology. They are often portrayed as hostile and monstrous beings who come from, here are your two options, come from the sea or underground. And we know, again, from biblical thinking, that those two things are actually connected in a number of ways, either in terms of the abyss or in terms of giant traditions. And it continues later. The Fomorians were portrayed as giants and sea raiders. So those are your two options again. and it goes into the etymology about, well, like which is it? Because depending on what etymology you pick, it might be from the old Irish, mer, sea, Fomorian, mer. That maybe that's the connection. Maybe it means something like undersea ones. Another suggestion is that it comes from mor, not mer, but mor, which means great or big. It means something like great underworld ones or underworld giants or nether giant. I mean, you get this etymological thing going back and forth. But, that was just fascinating because not only do you have underworld and watery abyss connections with the whole ancient Near Eastern and biblical concept of the abyss. Okay, the three-tiered cosmology, the waters under the earth, which is the abyss. But you also have a giant connection between, with the sea peoples. Okay, the Philistines were part of the sea peoples in the ancient Near East. You have a number of these little attachments to these biblical ideas. Now, I'm not, who knows how this kind of thing was transmitted, but I think oral tradition by some means into these areas well before the Christian period that are drawn from ancient Near Eastern biblical stuff, or that the biblical world at the very least. But I would think, you're going to have Jews travel to these places. You're going to have people even before the descendants of Abraham travel to these places, and this is going to be this cultural memory, which is an idea broadly accepted in at least in the evangelical tradition. I think even wider, but that works here in terms of the geography and in terms of the material, at least that we're narrowly talking about here.
What struck me also,
I found that really, really interesting.
What really struck me about when the article that listed the names of several of these creatures, these deities, is one of them was the god who taught them poetry. Another one taught them war. One of them taught them how to make
culture heroes.
Yeah. One of them taught them how to make magic. I mean, it just reminded me of Enoch, of the Watchers who
and the Apkallu, because if you read Berosus, again, think about your Hellenization prior to the Christian period. You have the connection there with the Apkallu and Oannes. Again, there you go with the sea origin. Boy.
Yeah, I mean, you have one who he taught weapon making, and then he taught magic, and then he taught. That's the son of the Watchers right there.
Yeah.
I'll give you a little bit more on the Fomorians. So this comes from the Encyclopedia of Celtic Mythology and Folklore, and it gives one of the etymologies as more as well, Mike, and but it gives the word phantom. And so I thought of how sometimes the Rephaim is translated as a shade or a phantom, I think in Job or whatever it is found. And it talks about them as a monstrous and demonic race who preyed upon the various settlers, waging war, intermarrying until finally they were defeated by the Tuatha Danann. A gigantic and evil Fomorian king Baelor was related to the Tuatha through his daughter, whose son was Lu. And if you look up who Lu is, you find that he's got some really strange connections with Apollo. So,
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, the cross fertilization here is really, I mean, you can get there through Hellenization. You can get there through, the Romans, appropriation of Hellenistic stuff. I mean, you can get there in terms of, again, the oral tradition of a flood event, the survival, the giants, the whole bit. And then like Brian was saying, that's actually appropriated by the pagan environment in very understandable, normal ways. And then that has to be, it has to be, done a 180 to, later on in the, when Christianity shows up there. But there actually is, something to this. It was just really interesting. Go ahead.
I see a new novel series coming. That's all I can say. I'm like, wow.
Oh, here we go. With lots of apostrophes in the vocabulary. Lots of glottal stops. Good luck
that's
with
going to be a tough one. Yeah.
Yeah. Good luck with that. What is it? The Cockney pronunciation? I don't know. Just I'm fooling with you here. So, any other thoughts about what the content of the articles?
Yeah, I'm struck for whatever reason. I don't know why, just my bent or whatever, by this group, the Tuat, the Danann, the children of Danu, the goddess. And just thinking about its relationship to this, this festival of Samhain. And maybe this can give us a little bit of conversation too. The idea of death and Samhain and new life. So New Year, like it's the New Year holiday, as we talked about, and thinking about how it's a harvest holiday. They talked about that quite a bit. And so this is, you have to have all of your food in and protected because the harsh winter is coming, and you have to have all your animals, off the hills and stuff like that. And then moving kind of in a weirder direction, they talk about the human sacrifice, that there was some evidence of cannibalism, and then I thought that kind of all took its direction from this group, the Tuath, that destroyed the Fomorians, and then who were themselves defeated by basically the ancient Celtic people. I forget what their name is, but so the Celtic people are the modern people of Ireland. So it's just kind of one group removed. And I was reading it through the Moses Deuteronomy 32 worldview that you've talked so much about, and the darkness that Paul talks about, that the nations are given over, and just thinking about that. And if God really did put these heavenly beings over these different, places. So what it says is that it talks about how the Celtic people and the Tuath made a kind of a covenant with each other, so that the Celts would then reign on the land, and then the Tuath would reign under the land in the underworld. And so there was some connection to them becoming the fairies of Ireland that Doug already talked about, in how these are not Tinkerbell from Disneyland sort of creatures, and that they would enter through these mounds to the underworld. And I was just over at New Grange, which is one of the oldest sites on Europe, and it's like they call it this burial chamber. I'm not really sure what it's about. And you walk in, and it's all lined up to the solstice, and the sun only shines for 10 minutes a year on the inside of this thing, and nobody knows what they're doing. But it seems to me that it could very well be related to some kind of a remembrance or a need to pacify these deities that lived in this place that God had put them under.
It just elevates in my mind how awesome St. Patrick was.
Yeah.
The dude just comes and just like, God's church is, on this rock, like the gates of hell will not prevail, because the gates of hell are everywhere. All these mounds, there's one over there. He goes and builds a church, and that's what they did. They built churches on these mounds. Some of them, like, nope, gate of hell here. Nope, we're building a church on it. I mean, that's kind of awesome in a way.
That takes a little boldness. to do that.
There was a story, if you remember, there was a story that they gave, one of the articles gave of Patrick, and some sort of a thing happened on Samhain to him as well. So they talked about how wars would take place on this day, and Patrick was right in there.
Yeah, and there was, in that story, supposedly St. Patrick had even had an encounter with a fairy.
Oh,
which was really interesting.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, he had an encounter with the fairy and like had an exchange with them, which is really interesting because in the Halloween in America article, it talks about how fairies are sort of this image of fallen angels who are not able to be in heaven or hell at this current time, so they inhabit the earth and make mischief and all of that. You're right, it's so interesting. They're supposedly fairies are just the angels who followed Lucifer in his rebellion.
Yeah, it is interesting that you have, I mean, you've got two prongs, to the biblical, notion of the underworld, as far as the dark denizens that either inhabit it or are imprisoned there, or that kind of thing. You've got you got your Genesis 6 bunch that's imprisoned there, but then you've got Rephaim, which of course the whole Second Temple Jewish notion of demons being the disembodied spirits of the giant clans. Of course, Rephaim is one of those. So you got both of these elements there. And again, for the sake of listeners, I mean, my demons book isn't out yet. Who knows when that's going to show up? Turn the manuscript in, but then you're at the mercy of whoever you turned it into. But the reason why biblical literature is unique there, because all the scholars point this out. Oh, the Ugaritic text, they just have the Rephaim as, dead ancient warrior kings and all. Well, no kidding. It's because if you're a Second Temple Jewish writer, and you're borrowing or you're responding to the Apkallu stuff, these aren't good guys, okay? So yeah, the warrior kings are going to be denizens of this dark, fearful place, the underworld that we associate with death, and not the presence of God. And we know who they are, and because of the whole watcher element of this, which Ugaritic doesn't have. Of course, you're going to talk about them in terms of giants and kings and also disembodied spirits. It's very understandable, given the backdrop that the biblical writer is responding to. And here you have, in this Celtic stuff, you actually have all of those different elements. You've got the warrior element, you've got the disembodied spirit element, you've got the giant element, and they just they sort of follow their own trajectories then. Fairies is one. The Fomorians, the giants is another. And then, it's really hard not to look at this and think that somehow, and again, I'm not saying that they had to be exposed to texts like the Hebrew Bible or something like that, but somehow through either oral tradition or hearing something, or, either oral tradition on their own turf, or again, getting this mediated through people from the Mediterranean, whether it's Hellenism or the Romans or it's Jewish Christian travel, who knows, okay? But they've got the elements there. Either they're indigenous or there's something else, or maybe a little bit of both. But it's hard to look at this and not conclude that they're really, the elements are there. And they're not just made up later on by, Christian writers in the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries who are trying to sort of spin something, for the sake of, stamping out, a certain idea.
I thought also is just interesting how the Deuteronomy 32 worldview is held by these people in one way or the other. When I'm not going to try to pronounce the Tuatha, they were inhabiting the land. And then the gods of the Celts actually came and then pushed them off. And then the Celts followed. So like there was a spiritual war ahead of time before the Celts actually inhabited the land. And that's just that was interesting to me, how this perspective is everywhere in the ancient world. Well, in the pre-modern world.
It is. And again, just for the sake of a critical listener, it's like, you guys are saying that, this Bible stuff, got inserted. And this is you can build this argument without even appeal to the Bible, because of, Plato and other.
Yeah.
Well, it's like when I went on that pagan podcast, Voice of Olympus, the first episode. And again, I do recommend people listen to that, even though the audio is terrible. But like for the first 5 minutes, this guy's just, classical Greco-Roman reference after reference from, quote unquote, pagan sources that have nothing to do with the Bible. And it's articulating the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. There it is. You don't need, biblical material to sort of, justify all this stuff. Everybody had a sense of this. And scripture, of course, is consistent with that, but it's also unique in that, this is a punishment from the Most High, and there's actually a plan for it. It has a purpose. It's dare I say, purpose driven. There's something behind it that's missing, from the pagan sphere in terms of salvation history that you get in the biblical sphere. But it's just there. It's as though this was sort of the starting point. It's as though that's the case. You've got this post-flood starting point all over the place. And again, I just don't see that as coincidental.
And this becomes the point for us to everyone on this program, I believe just about, has written some kind of book related to this issue. So start with Mike Heiser's Unseen Realm and check out the rest of our books because we write on this. But I don't mean to turn this discussion into a different direction, but this is an additional element that we've only lightly touched upon. But I also think that a lot. This is rooted in an agricultural culture. And the essence of paganism is earth religion, and so this is why whether it's the fairy spirits, everything's connected to the earth, and whether it's the sacrifice so that you can get the good food or see what the future is. All these pagan elements are rooted in earth worship. Paganism is essentially a nature religion. And I just wanted to bring up, sort of connected to that, was, I think this is the power of, the scripture, the Jewish religion, was that it, for the first time in the midst of, where every religion was pagan and earth-oriented, you've got Genesis coming in, and it literally demystifies nature. It literally desacralizes nature. And this is what pagans complain about. Modern pagans even complain about how, they'll accuse the Bible of being the reason why we're polluting the earth and all this stuff, because we've desacralized nature. But that's actually not the case. But it actually was the moment where freedom was they were wrested from that bondage. And it's interesting to note, though, that but the Jews had festivals as well for all of the agricultural festivals. Yeah. They had their own version of it, but they were oriented towards, obviously, the God of nature and not nature itself. And I think that's just a beautiful picture of how, the Jews sort of brought that transformation that we are now ultimately reaping the fruit of, as Christianity added the additional element that brought about modern science and technology that allowed us to harness nature as God intended in Genesis 1 using technology. And yes, we must be responsible. Yes, we have to, have that respect. We're, in a sense of tending, but it's also the essence of the Jewish worldview was that, whereas the pagan worldview is the earth is holy and sacred, the Jewish worldview was nature is chaos, and God wants us to bring order into chaos through technology and through human dominion. And that, to me, is ultimately, it's interesting that still is the picture of what we have today. Now we have a massive, a modernized version of earth worship. And what is it rooted in? It's rooted in, rejecting this Judeo-Christian principle. And I find it interesting that it's the same battle that's still going on that Patrick was battling back then, just a new version of it.
Yeah, it's a subtle difference between saying we're doing this ritual and if we don't, the whole thing's gonna break down. As opposed to, we're doing this ritual to celebrate,
Yeah.
what God has done. We celebrate the harvest because we have a good God who gives us, the things we need to eat, and so on and so forth. And it's gonna operate the way God intended it to be. He is the ultimate restrainer, of chaos. It doesn't depend on us. Where in paganism, there's a little, I would say not just a little, but a lot of the sense that it is human dependent. Even though you have this spiritual element, it's as though, you see what I'm trying to say, that there's more of a, we don't just,
it's works based.
Yeah. That everything is performance, based, as opposed to, there's reaping the benefit of, worshiping a good God, as opposed to a performance based approach that everything's going to descend into chaos. It depends on us.
Yeah.
And not the Most High, that kind of thing. It's a subtle difference, but it's actually an important difference.
And doesn't it help you have to understand all of this and understand these origins? To me, it helps me have sympathy for the people at that time, the Celtic people who were coming up with all of these mythologies, because without that worldview, without our worldview, you have to try to figure everything out. Why is this happening? And if you don't have the understanding of creation the way we do, you're looking at, okay, every year at this time of year, everything dies. Like, what is happening? That must mean that the veil between worlds is thin at this time of year, and death is coming through and it's killing everything. So how can we stop that from happening? What kind of offerings can we provide to, you can see that logic unfolding. And also, kind of on that note, when you look at where these myths came from in antiquity, I think one thing a lot of Christians make the mistake of when we're thinking about Halloween or paganism is in general is looking at modern paganism or neo-paganism, like Wicca as it is now, specifically like Gardnerian Wicca, which didn't even come into existence until the 1940s. They have this claim that they're this ancient, witch society, but they're not. This is a new religious movement. They are not good people to look to find out what Samhain means and how it should be celebrated and all of that. But we look at quote unquote modern witches and we watch what they're doing, and we're trying to figure out what Halloween means or what its origins are from the way they explain it and the way they celebrate it. And then they just have made up their whole new religious movement about it. It has nothing to do with the ancient Celtic people and why they did what they did and who they worshiped and why they celebrated and what their rituals were. Their witchcraft, as we could call it, I suppose, that was practiced in ancient times bears very little resemblance to what modern Wiccans and witches are doing now, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
I think that's a great point, Nat. Like, why does this stuff fascinate me so much? It's not because I'm interested in just finding out stories. It's because I want to know how can I take the Christian message and apply it and speak to it in a way that somebody's going to understand from their context. And, we're telling the same story. I mean, that seems to be what this entire show is about. They tell the story. We tell the story. We tell the story a different way, and we have a very different solution to the problems that are, bring about this kind of a festival that with all its debauchery and stuff that we read about in the ancient world and that we see even in our own day in the way that Halloween is practiced. And to know the origins of these things, where they come from, and to understand why they come from the way they come, and to understand the Deuteronomy 32 and those kinds of things, then you can actually give a response to somebody that's going to at least make sense from their context.
Yeah. And, I watched such an interesting little video. Are you guys familiar with that YouTube channel Lutheran Satire. They did a great one about Horace and Christmas that was just blew the whole thing out of the water. They had one about Halloween, and it was really short and to the point, but the basic point being made was that so many Christians, specifically, fundamentalist Christians, will say, you can't have Christmas, you can't have Halloween, you can't do these things because they resemble these pagan practices. This is their origin, and if you do it, you're a pagan too. And they will also, in the same breath, say, well, you can't be a Christian just by saying prayers and by going to church and by, doing Christian things. That doesn't make you a Christian. So the irony is they believe you can't be a Christian by doing X, Y, and Z, which we would agree as well. But you can be an accidental pagan by mirroring the things that the pagans did on some level. So it's a complete contradiction, because I would say, and I, as I've maintained in a lot of the things I've written about Christmas and that kind of thing, you cannot be an accidental pagan. You just can't. It's just not. It's the intention of your heart and in where you're coming from. And I'm not saying we should go out and paint the town red with looking like demons and stuff every year on Halloween. But what I am saying is, if little children want to go and get candy and this kind of thing on Halloween, they're not little burgeoning occultists. They're not doing it to have a pagan celebration and to be little pagans. That if you can't be a Christian accidentally, then you can't be a pagan accidentally, is kind of what the point of that video was. I totally agree.
I think that's an excellent point, Matt. And I think it's a great sort of thing for us to be ending on, because that's what we're dealing with, for those who really are against it. But I also think it reflects a kind of a mindset in our society at large that I see as a very dangerous thing, and that is this growing notion that when all of us here have this love of the past and learning about the past, and I think we all have this understanding that we have to understand people are like great men in history and women of history are people of their time periods, and so that even the Christians who tried to stop it, they had some errors in the way they thought as well, right? Like, All Souls Day is praying for the dead, praying for dead Christians. Well, we wouldn't accept that, but if you're a little bit more understanding, if you realize, but in terms of the culture at that time, they don't think the way we do. And so what I'm saying is the society that we live in now has this tendency to look back and find anything that we don't agree with, and that justifies rejecting it as evil. For example, and this is where we're going. George Washington had slaves. That the next thing that you're going to see in our culture is people are already trying to get rid of George Washington statues and Thomas Jefferson. Why? Because they had slaves, and so you completely ignore all the positive, good elements of who they were and how they built what we now became, right? And so it's this, I don't know what you'd call it, maybe chronological snobbery, where
it's anachronistic.
Yeah, we're the superior moral beings. So you look back and you see, and you just, this judgment is everything else before us is just wrong. And that's the Christian version of that, is this mentality that I think what Natalie was talking about, and that's something we need to be aware of.
It's like neo-puritanicalism, it's where we're into, which is kind of a frightening era. If you wouldn't want to live in Nathaniel Hawthorne's nightmare world, then I don't know, where we're headed as a culture is scary. But one of the reasons I was convinced that the fear against modern Halloween was it was overhyped. It's one of the few times our whole community gets together, and where families come outside their home. Yeah. And they just, strangers get together, and we all share this kind of a marvelous cultural thing, and people are giving away stuff. And I mean, there's in our era, in my little Midwestern town, you don't just go to your neighbor's house and knock on the door and ask for stuff, and it was really a wonderful cultural experience, and Christians really need to be a part of it. I mean, you can't just vacate the public square. You need to be salt and light in that environment. But before we end, I mean, one of my questions was, one of the things that I'm puzzled about is, so if 15 or 16 centuries ago, on this New Year's Day, the idea is the recently departed would come and visit your home, and so then you put goodies out for them in Ireland. And then eventually the church convinced people that no, it's not recently departed. These are demons coming to your home. And so don't put stuff out for them. But people still did, I guess maybe to appease the demons so they wouldn't terrorize people. And then somehow over 1,000 years, that evolves into trick-or-treating. And oh no, I'm sorry. In one of the articles mentioned that no, it's not ghosts who come, not demons who come. This particular guy in Ireland said, no, it's the people in purgatory. They're let out for a little while, and then they come, and then you give them. So it's just souls of the dead again, and you give them your treats to your family, your recently departed family and friends, and then they go on their merry way. Where did the church go wrong in trying to subvert this holiday?
Yes.
Was it purgatory? I mean, this is like recently that people in Ireland were saying this. I don't know if that's still a thought today, but then that evolves in America, at least, to trick-or-treating, which is just interesting, just from an anthropological standpoint.
Yeah.
But I mean, is that syncretism? Is that what happened? Is that why, of all the holidays that the church tried to Christianize, it sort of failed with this one? I mean, what's going on there?
Well, I would say it's, the fancy academic term, bad theology. I mean, it just because I mean, if you're trying to, you're not going to be terribly successful if you're trying to subvert a performance-based system or an earth-based system or a human effort system with one that is another of the same, but now we have Christian, characters and terms attached to the same approach, to humanity's spiritual need, or some amalgamation of those ideas from, within a Christian context. So if you substitute a bad theology in place of a more bad theology, it just doesn't work well, but just in what you were saying about the neighborhood thing. I mean, to me, that's not a bad analogy to, if you're a Christian in these periods, in these places, I mean, you have a decision to make. So, here they start bringing out the corn and the stalks and the pumpkins, and you know what's coming. It's Samhain time again. Okay. So we have a choice to make. Either we're going to avoid all of this stuff, end of story, or isn't it probably more fruitful to enter into the celebration, but in sort of an apologetic way, like you go to your neighbor and say, hey, isn't this fun or interesting, or I know why we're doing this, but do you really know why we're doing this?
Yeah.
Where do these ideas come from? Because if you can get a person to wonder about, hey, look what I'm doing, where does all this come from? There's your invitation to help a person think more carefully about it. You take the practice and show how there's a relationship to things that Scripture does talk about in terms of its logic, but there's also a better solution. There's a better set of ideas that extend from this thing we're doing than either dismissing it all, like you're a materialist and you're just doing it because you like candy or Kit Kats or whatever. I mean, there's something better to be learned and thought about, than that. And the same for the pagan. Well, you kind of get why we're doing this a little bit more than our atheist friend over there. You kind of know a little bit more about this history, and here are the roots of it. Here are the questions it asks, or here's the problem, the spiritual problem that they were trying to solve.
Yeah.
Scripture understands that. Scripture knows where you're coming from, and is attached to it in some way. But the solutions and the answers to the questions are different. So you can have a discussion about, maybe this stuff is a dim reflection or some inversion of something God really does want us to think about. And, Scripture has just a better set of answers, a better discussion to have on those things. So to me, that's better than just saying, I'm out of here. and I'm never going to use this, kind of quirky, odd, and yes, it has pagan roots, this thing. But I mean, what would St. Patrick have done? I mean, it's somebody who's a serious believer, not just your nominal Catholic, grand poobah or something like that. A serious Christian is going to look at this, and I think would like Patrick. Okay, we can see the pieces on the board, and we know what we know the game that's being played here. Let's do something with this. Let's use this as a tool to subvert bad thinking or bad theology or evil or whatever. And we'll steer the discussion. We will divert the attention over here to what God really does want us to think about. I mean, maybe that's not going to always work the best for everyone who wants to, play the game that way. We're all fallible. I get that. But at least the discussion happens. At least there's the potential for a Christian to come along and say, yeah, I get it, but have you really thought about this?
Yeah.
A lot of us who traffic in Middle Earth, even among, fellow Christians or among, people who aren't Christian at all. I mean, this is actually what we're trying to do. We're trying to get people to the table to have a discussion and think better about something, but kind of meeting them where they're at. So why is it, and again, I'll speak to the Middle Earth community, why is it okay for you to be into something like UFOs and Bigfoot and, whatever it is, and meet people there to have a Christian discussion, but it's bad for, an 8th, 9th, 10th century Christian to do the same thing? That just seems really inconsistent to me.
Excellent.
And I think the answer is we have a modern conceit that everybody before us did it wrong, that there were no true believers out there. They're all these, whacked out, fill in the blank, whatever group they belong to. They weren't us.
Mm-hmm.
So they're wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Well, again, is that really consistent thinking? It just doesn't seem like it is to me.
Height of arrogance.
So let's try to redeem, what needs to be redeemed.
Amen.
I mean, what else is there? You got two choices: let it be unredeemed, or try to redeem it. It doesn't seem that complicated to me.
Yeah, I was thinking of an analogy as you were talking. For some reason, Halloween has reminded me quite a bit of Christmas, just in the things that we read in terms of New Year time of year. So one is Halloween is their New Year, and Christmas kind of celebrates ours, and some of the other cultures would celebrate it at the winter solstice. And I was thinking about the idea of the solstice. I mean, God's the one that put the sun up in the sky. God's the one that causes the earth to rotate on its axis. It's not some pagan idea that the the new year begins with the days getting longer on the winter solstice. That's something God made. And as a Christian growing up, I never heard anybody ever talk about that. Like there was no category in my mind for even what to do with this, other than maybe some sort of a naturalism that it's just all kind of accidental or something. We just didn't talk about it. And the pagans not only talked about it, but they celebrated things on those days. If God's the one that made it, then why in the world can't we have an explanation for it ourselves?
Yeah. Well, a lot of this was new to me. You brought up Christmas. Over at the Naked Bible podcast, we did a whole episode last year on, is Christmas a pagan holiday, that kind of thing. And again, people can go listen to that, because we got into specific scriptural examples of what Brian was talking about earlier. This appropriation. God did, and the Israelites did. They did appropriate pagan things, and again, for very specific reasons that would again either blunt non-truth and direct people to truth. So we have the same thing again, this attempt in the case of Christmas by people who were serious about, the Christian faith. I mean, the real Christian faith, trying to, again, do something culturally to direct people away from one thing and toward another. Again, to get them to the table. to have the discussion, so to speak, to help them think better thoughts about what it is they're concerned about in the ritual, what they think the ritual means, why they think they need to do it. Again, you can have those conversations. And again, it's not like there are no minefields there. I mean, there are. You have to be able to think carefully and draw lines. Okay. And again, this is why I think, going back to the earlier question, where do we go wrong with this? There was just sloppy theological thinking. I mean, just honestly, it was a job done poorly that could have been done better, as opposed to just never attempting to do the job at all. And so this I think was useful for me. Again, a lot of the Halloween stuff was new. So I'm glad we did the topic.
Me too.
Well, I as we leave, I want to extend thanks to everybody who participated. Glad you could all be here. And again, I think this was a good episode.
Bye. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Have a great
Signing
Halloween.
out.
Hello.